Well, to discuss this, we are now joined by Pierella Paci, a practice manager for poverty and equity global practice at the World Bank, as well as Tracey Henry, the CEO of Tshikululu Social Investments. Ladies, great to have you with us here on the program. Thanks so much for your time.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Tracey, let me start with you. Talk to us about the strikingly high inequality in South Africa at the moment.
Deanne, the inequality that we experience in South Africa and that the World Bank has highlighted in the report that was released in March this year is something that we've been, living with for a very long time. We talk about poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And in the report, it really highlights the drivers, particularly in South Africa, which is the most unequal society in the world, which is driven by legacy issues, particularly in terms of race, that plays a big part, and the opportunities that are provided to different parts of the community, depending on where you were born and the opportunities that have been provided to you.
Yeah, Pierella, this is a very sad situation that we find ourselves in South Africa. More so, I imagine, than a lot of other countries because of the issues like intergenerational issues. Children born to very, very poor families without any outside assistance, having lost the battle before they even start out in life.
Absolutely. And as you say, our report that focuses on all these SACU countries, the 5 Southern African countries, shows something we've known for a while, but that South Africa is actually country with the highest inequality in the world, if you measure it using the standard measure for income inequality, which is the Gini coefficient. And that situation over the last 20 years basically has not improved. It's improved a very small amount. And I think that's probably even more of a concern. But then it's sort of not surprising, given what the factors are, as you say, underlying this inequality, which is basically to do mostly with inherited factors. As Tracey was pointing out, in South Africa, for example, we decompose the amount of inequality in 5 different components. And one of them is the inherited characteristics. So whatever, basically what you're born with, and perhaps even before birth. And in South Africa, that explains 1/5 of the overall inequality. And in fact, over time, that amount has actually gone up. So now it's like 22% of the overall inequality. It's explained by things like gender, the education of your parents, wealth of birth. And if you put in race, that amount doubles. So that means that close to half of the inequality is basically something that you're born with, and it's very difficult to shake off.
Yeah. It really is. And it's a cycle. It's a never-ending cycle that we keep talking to. But Tracey, of the 55% of South Africans in dire poverty, the reality is that most of these are black women. And there are no policies and investments that are in place that are urgently needed to address this. Is this not something that we should look at it as a matter of urgency?
Well, the issues are really systemic in our society. And if we think about women in particular, whether it's in rural or urban areas, who in many instances are the sole providers for their families, living on social grants that are needed to care for their families. And then you have the inequalities in terms of opportunities, whether it's in the workplace as well. You put on top of that inequalities in terms of access to quality education, and you add the lens of gender-based violence to these discussions. It is a very challenging environment for women in particular in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And that's the reality that we faced with.
Yeah. When Pierella, when we look at even things here in South Africa, we've got issues of reliable water, we've got huge unemployment rates, we've got the cost of electricity being at at record highs and increasing and still being unreliable. I mean, these are, I suppose, the top priorities for most municipalities, and education coming in at priority number 15. Talk to us about this. Have we got our priorities a little mixed, or is that kind of, obviously water, I mean, these are things that it should be, that's something that we would hope would be sorted, and something like education would be more up there now at this point, but it's not. What does this all mean?
And absolutely. So it's a really difficult challenge, I believe. And I think partly because, as I say, there is some inherited history that is going very difficult to shape differently. But let me go back to some of the issues you just highlighted. So things like education. So our study shows that if you look at individual characteristics at the time where the analysis was done, education actually explains the majority of the inequality. So basically, it's a flag. You can just see that better educated people actually obviously get the much higher on the income distribution. Tertiary education, post-secondary education in particular. South Africa actually does reasonably well in terms of participation in basic education. But then, as you pointed out, the main issue is quality. The inequality in the quality of the education offered to children. It's across spatial differences. It's staggering. And I think that obviously is then reflected into the opportunity the kids get to get jobs and so on as they grow older. And the fact that 50% of youth are unemployed, and obviously we know what level of education they have, what type of social background they have. So the inequality in the labor market, as we call it, in the job sphere, sort of comes on top to the inherent inequality and gets combined. So I think the challenge here really is to provide more inclusive service delivery. And you mentioned all of that. I think starting from water, electricity, education, health, and so on. And the word I think here is not spending more, because actually South Africa spends considerable amount compared to countries at the same level of income, of GDP. But it's more equal as opposed to, as I say, more. And I think quality is a key issue, especially in the excluded area, which is why spatial inequality is also so relevant. Yeah. Because I think it's really striking. As you pointed out, women, especially Black women, suffer the most. As I was saying before, inherited characteristics are a major determinant. And gender and race combined explain a very large percentage of the inequality.
Tracey, we always ask that question, why should business care? I mean, what difference does it make to them? As long as they, have their workforce and they're making money, why should they care? And what is the role of social investment in this burden of unemployment, poverty, and inequality?
So, Leanne, we've always spoken about people, profits, and planets for many years. And more recently, we speak about ESG, which is environment, social, and governance frameworks. And I think business has realized for many years that it's not just about profits. You operate within a broader system, and that community directly impacts in terms of the infrastructure and the well-being. So we cannot, and business does recognize that in order to grow and to make profits, you need a strong society, you need a healthy society, and you need a society that will be able to feed into the labor market. And I think that, if we think about the last 2 years, and we think about the significant role that business has played, particularly during the pandemic, working with government in terms of the rollout of healthcare, services, dealing with food insecurity, And business played a very strong role in this regard, recognizing that collectively we do need to work together if we're going to build a more sustainable society, whether it's on the education spectrum, the health spectrum, and even dealing with issues around gender-based violence.
Yeah. Just as we wrap up, Pierre, let me ask you this question. The top 1% in South Africa have immense wealth. 17.8 million rand average net holding. I mean, that's what we're talking about, with the bottom half of the population who are actually wealth negative. I mean, there's just nothing that they have. What does this mean? And how has BEE affected this? What needs to be done to change the situation? A lot of questions in one, but I'll leave it to you to wrap this up for us.
This is why this is, I think, it's an immense, huge challenge, because the type of inequality you have is so deeply rooted. As you say, I think the only way of addressing the massive amount of wealth inequality you have is basically by offering opportunity. It's going to take time. It's going to take a huge amount of time. As you pointed out, we actually, in the report for South Africa, we couldn't do that for our country. We only were able to do that for South Africa and Namibia. But we actually show the amount of wealth inequality and the component of it. I think in terms of financial assets, ownership of land, and some other aspect of wealth, South African is, I think, staggering, the amount of inequality you have, and you pointed out very well. So what do you do? I think the South African government, they use redistribution. So things like social assistance, social spending, reasonably well and effective in sort of trying to level the field, but this is sort of exposed. It doesn't address the root inequality. I think so policies have been put in place, but they were not necessarily the right policy to address this issue that it's deeply rooted in the wealth. Mm-hmm. So you need to go back and actually just trying to offer better opportunities. And the better opportunities, as we discussed before, is just really mostly question of having inclusive service delivery. From water and electricity are going to be a big challenge, especially given the climate change you're facing. But it's key that rather than offer more in some area or more to some people, there is more sort of inclusive policy on that. Education is going to be absolutely key. And again, here I'm not going to develop into this, but I think moving the focus from redistributing income to actually addressing the wealth inequality by giving a sort of better opportunity to disadvantaged population is key. And why do you need to do that? You need to do that, as Tracey was pointing out, the inequality, we actually had a report, previous report on Human Capital Index, which shows what is the gap in productivity that for a country. Indeed. That's used simply to let the fact that some children are left behind.
All right.
And for South Africa, I think it's about 30 to 35%.
Sure.
So your workers could be 30 to 35% more productive. And that is something I don't think in current climate you can afford to ignore.
And that's the reality, the harsh reality of what that was. Ladies, thank you. Thanks for being with us this morning just to talk about this very important issue. Pierella Paci, a practice manager for poverty and equity global practice at the World Bank, as well as Tracey Henry, the CEO of Tshikululu's Social Investment.